Hey folks, so this week we're going to talk about psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theories. I should have probably reversed those. Psychoanalysis came first, psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theories. What we'll get into is that psychoanalysis is the original theory, and then psychodynamic approach it is the same, but is really for individuals who are not psychiatrists. So let's talk about the history a bit. Psychoanalysis was created by Sigmund Freud. That was his approach. He was a medical doctor, so started off his career. There was no mental health related stuff before him. He's kind of the father of our entire field. Um, and I think most people think that we've kind of thrown out all of his uh, stuff, but there's still some things that linger and are helpful, and some things worth considering, I guess. But anyway, Sigmund Freud, Dr. Freud was our originator, and psychoanalysis is what he created. What he noticed was, and I'm heavily diluting this, but while he was working as a medical doctor, he learned that some of his patients would feel better after they were talking to him. So like a talking cure, as it were. He started to explore that some more, came up with this belief that um, most mental health related struggles were things that uh, came up from our past and were lingering, and that in talking about them, we could work them out and move forward and live healthy lives. So, some of the underpinnings of Freud's theory, though, were that we only really evolved emotionally and, um, from a character perspective until we were in our teenage years. So, like, we only really evolved until we hit puberty, according to Freud. And so, this is where he came up with his psychosexual theories of development. He believed that uh, basically at the different stages of life, all the way up until we became adolescents, we were developing, um, but we were developing related to sexually centered sort of underpinnings. And so you look at it, Freud believed that there were the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages of development. We always hear about oral, anal, and phallic, but there's also latency and genital. I will screw up the ages without having my notes open on this. But the oral stage of development was basically birth to 1 year old ish. For those who have parents, or for those, we all have parents. For those who are parents or um, have children in their lives, whether it be younger siblings or folks like that, or you work with kids or whatever the case may be, you will know that from the birth to like 1 year old stage, everything is about feeding. So the oral stage of development has to do with feeding, sucking on things. Children learn to suck on a pacifier or their thumb to calm themselves. Um, uh, they start to cut teeth. That has to that becomes kind of a process even into the like 1 to 2 year age range. Um, that's the oral stage of development. Everything is about feeding and suckling, and everything is mouth related. The anal stage of development has to do with potty training. So the anal stage of development is um, that 2 to 3 year old or slightly beyond, depending stage. And so after that, we move into the phallic stage of development, which is where Freud believed that children learned about their genitals and learned about what feels good and all of that sort of stuff. And so um, that became the focus. And that was a slightly longer stage of development. That went from sort of the preschool years into kind of early grade school when we hit the latency stage of development, where Freud believed that no changes were really happening. It was a time of sort of a lack of development sexually within the overall framework, but then we get into the genital stage of development, which is what leads into the adolescent and puberty stages, where Freud believed that all of our motivations were very sexualized, having to do with the pleasure principles and reproduction and all of that sort of stuff. And then anything that happened to us later on in life was related to a hiccup that occurred during the oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital stages of development. And again, this may sound ridiculous, but we still retain some of this stuff. So if you are a nail biter, if you smoke cigarettes or smoke anything vape at this point, at this time in our history, um, I had a supervisor who used to talk about being orally fixated because she always had to have like a Coke or a Pepsi. I think she was a Pepsi drinker, but she always had to have like a drink with her at all times. Um, it was a comfort thing. And so those are all actually signs Freud believed of oral retentiveness, that we struggled with something during our oral stage of development. And so that is how we continued to work it out. My dad was a dentist, and he hated it when other people did it, but he would like keep a toothpick in his mouth occasionally. Same thing. Um, and so, um, if you've ever heard of the phrase anal retentive, that comes from Freudian psychoanalytic theory. So, individuals who are anal retentive are people who are very detail oriented, very fixated on um, uh, cleanliness, things of that sort. That was Freud's belief that we had a hard time navigating that stage in our development, the anal stage of development. Something occurred there, a trauma of some sort, and it could have been mild, but it interacted with us at that point in our developmental stage. I don't have any really good examples of the phallic stage of development, but that gives you kind of a picture of the oral and anal stages of development. Also, people who are particularly messy, that would be the opposite, but it would be that same reaction. Either you become very fixated on cleanliness or you become very um, messy. I don't have a better word. So those are some Freudian beliefs about psychoanalysis. So Freud believed that the role of the mental health professional was to uh, help the client to regress, help the client to get back to that stage of development, work out whatever the trauma was that occurred there. Oftentimes it was something sexual, he believed sexual, with sort of a sexual interest of the opposite sex or same sex parent. This is where he came up with the Oedipus and Electra complex. Most people know the Oedipus complex or have heard of it. The Electra complex is not as sort of well known. Um, but um, the Oedipus complex is named after the Greek figure Oedipus in the play Oedipus Rex. It's about a king who has a child and is told by one of the oracles that the child will eventually kill him and take over the kingdom or whatever. I'm butchering this. So he tells his servants to have the child executed, but instead of having the baby executed, they put the baby um, on a hillside or something of that sort. And so he gets picked up by one of the neighboring villages and is raised. And so you would think then that the king is still safe. The king believes he's still safe, and so kind of goes on with his life. And at some point, decides to have a competition. And so Oedipus, who is growing up in the neighboring village, and is being trained as a warrior and is physically adept and whatnot, goes to compete in this challenge with the king, and through a series of events, eventually kills the king and marries the queen, which is his mother. But he didn't know that. She didn't know that because he was, an orphan to another village. Eventually, he finds it out and he gouges out his own eyes. And so this is where Freud gets this idea of the Oedipus complex, is the idea of a young male child developing sexual fantasies about their mother and hating their father. And again, I really did not do the Oedipus myth or story justice there. The Electra complex is exactly the same thing. I don't know that there's a story attached to it. I know that in modern day geeky things, Electra, who is a character within the Daredevil franchise from Marvel Comics, is named after the Electra complex. Not that she has any sort of love experience with her father in any way that I'm aware of. I presume that the writers just thought it was a really cool name and sort of rugged, and so they named her that. But that is the same idea. The idea that a young female will develop sexual attractions towards her father, hate her mother as a result, because the opposite or the same sex parent is competition, is the way that Freud would have thought about it, and so he believed that that was kind of the central mental health issue that people would be struggling with. Um, and what's interesting is a lot of these things are based in some amount of fact. If you've lived your life with young children around you, you will know that. So, like the oral stage of development, children, it's all feeding and eating and suckling and soothing and all that sort of stuff with the oral, with oral features. The anal stage of development, the potty training stage, is very fixated on elimination processes and things like that, and so cleanliness and whatnot. So those are based in real observations that Freud made. Similarly, children will develop affections for one or another parent in some cases. And we have some of this stuff where we talk about tomboys and daddy's girls. I don't know if that is even still a term, but anyway, where a tomboys and mama's boys and whatever the case may be. That's what I was trying to get at. We still have some of those terminologies in our like current existence, and it's related to those observations that Freud made. Those aren't directly connected to Freud, but I think they illustrate the point. So further, Freud believed that what we needed to do was get back into those points in history, and so as a psychoanalyst, he would do regressions where he would have a person sort of lie on a couch and imagine themselves back in that stage of their development and talk about the things that they saw. And he did dream interpretation and some early instances of hypnosis and things like that didn't get really developed thoroughly from a mental health standpoint until a little bit later. Um, and he believed that then when you uncovered these things that you could heal. And that's not that different from how we work today. Some of the other stuff that Freud talked about was the he called it king baby syndrome. This was also the early stages of understanding psychosis. So Freud coined the term psychosis and psychotic. He believed that a person who was experiencing psychosis had delusional belief systems about themselves. That's, I think, unspoken, but I'm speaking it. So the delusions, the psychosis, Freud believed were, another instance of this sort of lingering mental health need that required regression. We still understand psychosis to be that way today. Like one of the central underpinnings for a psychosis diagnosis is that you have to have delusional thinking patterns. So a delusional thinking pattern is where you believe that you're the center of your own universe. Delusions of persecution are where you believe that someone is out to get you. Delusions of grandeur are where you believe that you are much better and more important than you actually are. Like you're someone to worship, to be worshipped. I mean, they're significant. Like someone who has unearned beliefs about who they are and sort of what they're about would be delusional. It's not just someone who has a slightly tuned up ego about themselves. Um, and so then I'm sorry, I'm doing this. I usually give this lecture completely without notes, and so I'm thinking through it in the moment. Um, so king baby syndrome or queen baby syndrome was Freud's belief that we were regressing back to a childhood state. We now know that as borderline personality disorder, and so that is still an active diagnosis today, is still kind of a challenging diagnosis today. Um, it used to be called borderline psychotic personality disorder, but we removed the psychosis part. But it's related. So Freud believed that we were psychotic three times in our lives. He believed that babies were psychotic, adolescents are psychotic, and then if you are psychotic as an adult, that is a mental health issue. But the babies and the adolescence part was part of normal development. And it fits within his psychosexual stages of development pattern. So I sometimes get people who get really offended when I say that Freud believed that babies are psychotic. It's because we have such a negative belief system attached to the idea of psychosis. We think that all psychotics are serial killers, which is not the truth. But um, they're another thing. But anyway, we can talk about that some other time. The So babies are psychotic according to Freud because when they cry, they expect all the big people in their lives to do everything for them. And so in Freud's belief system, that meant that the baby believed that they were the center of their own universe. I cry and they do everything they can to soothe me. And if you have had babies in your life, you know that that's true. You'll do anything to try to get the baby to stop crying. Um, check their diaper, burp them, feed them, hold them, anything to stop crying. And there's a bunch of concerns that come up with that, which we don't need to get into, but the need for parents to try to soothe their baby can cause all sorts of struggles at that stage of development. So that's a real thing. But that's why Freud said the babies were psychotic, is because the baby must believe itself to be the center of its own universe. And to be fair, even as children get a little bit older, they are fairly egocentric. Like they don't understand that other people have needs yet. Um, Freud believed then that we developed for a while in all sorts of different ways. And then during our adolescent years, regressed into psychosis again. And if you have ever had an adolescent in your life, you know that that's true, that they become very egocentric again. That they can do nothing wrong. Everyone is wronging them. They will defy reality to get their points across. I didn't wreck the car. It's the city's fault for putting that telephone pole in the wrong place. Just the most ridiculous things that you can imagine that make them the center of their own story, and everyone else is wrong, but they're right. Um, that's psychosis to Freud. And so if this happens again later in life, it's a true psychotic pattern, and that happens with borderlines and narcissistic personality disorders, where they believe that they are the center of their own universes, and they have all sorts of manipulations and problematic behaviors that get them in trouble around that. I've already rambled on for a while, so I'm not going to get into the underpinnings of all of this more deeply, or like how this plays out, but it does. And so that is another diagnosis that sticks with us from Sigmund Freud's original belief patterns. We also see that some hospitals, their psych wards, which we don't call them that anymore either. We call them, behavioral health units or human services units or whatever the case may be. We're much more strength focused than we used to be. But the mental health wards in hospitals used to be called regressed wings because of our understanding of mental health through the impact of Sigmund Freud. There were other psychoanalysts, Carl Jung, you know, um, Freud's daughter became a psychoanalyst, but Freud is the one that we all remember. And so I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theories were basically the same, and they are. To be a psychoanalyst, you have to be a psychiatrist. You have to have a medical degree. You have to be a medical doctor to be a psychoanalyst. That was something that Freud put in place because he was the first psychiatrist. He was the first medical doctor, mental health professional. And so that has just stayed the case throughout history, just for whatever reason, it's solidified. But non medical doctor, mental health professionals have picked up on psychoanalysis as a way that they wish to practice, that they see as a benefit. And so they're called psychodynamic theorists. That's the difference. If you want to practice with psychoanalysis, you would be a psychodynamic theorist, and that's fine. Um, but we can't be psychoanalysts unless we are medical doctors, psychiatrists specifically. Okay, that was my deep dive into all of that. I hope this was helpful. I hope it's interesting, and I would love to hear back from you folks. Take care then.